There are certain nonfiction writers, sometimes journalists or critics, whose particular talents set them apart from the rest. George Orwell or Pauline Kael are popularly thought of as talented writers, who helped lead society with their brilliant writings that changed the way society viewed certain ideas. Another writer to add to this list is Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly was a late 19th century news reporter who changed public policy, led the movement of undercover reporting, and went against the status quo. Mentioned in Life's 100 Women Who Changed the World magazine, Nellie's accomplishments have made her an influential woman that many writers still look up to in today's society. One major accomplishment in Nellie's life was admitting herself into a New York asylum for 10 days. This prompted her to write an expose acknowledging the harsh conditions the mentally ill faced, that changed the way society saw and treated the mentally ill in years to come. Elizabeth Cochrane, later known as Nellie Bly, was born in May 1864 to Michael and Mary Cochrane. She grew up in Cochrane's Mill, Pennsylvania. From the start, Elizabeth wanted to become a writer. During her childhood, she was rebellious and independent. She became even more independent when her father died when she was 6. In 1880, Elizabeth and her family moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Elizabeth was well educated in divorces and women's rights. When she read an article by the Quiet Observer disrespecting women, it prompted her to write a heated, argumentative response to the editor of the Pittsburgh Dispatch. The editor was impressed with the writing and put in an ad in the next newspaper edition, looking for the unknown writer. The editor was surprised that this unknown author was a girl and gave Elizabeth a chance to write a rebuttal to be published. Elizabeth was very much excited by this offer. The piece was published under the name of Nellie Bly, which was the name of a popular song during that time.
Other women could admire Nellie Bly's courage. More than anyone, I think she blazed the path for women to be reporters. There were very few women reporters in those days.
By becoming a women journalist at the time, Nellie proved that women could do just as much as men could. After producing many argumentative pieces, her competitors became frustrated with her writings and urged the Pittsburgh Dispatch to move her to cover more women-like issues. Nellie was moved to cover fashion and other topics women were interested in. This kind of writing was not Nellie's style. She pushed forward to get her job back. In 1887, Nellie Bly transferred to a new newspaper company called the New York World.
At that time, one of the careers that was open to women was writing. And Bly started out as a journalist working for a newspaper's women's page in Philadelphia, or rather in Pittsburgh, and then decided to try her luck in New York City. And she was turned down at one newspaper after another, but Joseph Pulitzer's New York World gave her a chance to show that she could be a reporter by doing undercover work at a notorious insane asylum. And the result was something that media history textbooks have been talking about ever since.
She took on the daring task of admitting herself into Blackwell Island's asylum for 10 days. This kind of reporting helped promote a new form of journalism called undercover reporting. Blackwell's Island was originally named after Elizabeth Blackwell and her husband James Blackwell. Originally, the asylum was designed to be a state-of-the-art institution, but once financial conflicts began to take place, it prevented the completion of the asylum. The 2 areas that were financially supported to be built became immediately insufficient to meet the insane's needs. The average number of patients for the asylum was approximately 800, but in later years the number of patients reached 1,700. In the early years, patients were clothed in striped clothes. Consequently, these striped clothes were those similar to the ones given out in the island's prison that was located across from the asylum. Breakfast would consist of bread and coffee. Supper consisted of bread, butter, and tea. 3 times a week, patients were served beef soup, and once a week, patients were served mush and molasses. Nellie acted like she was mentally sick and walked the streets looking mentally unstable. Eventually, people took notice, and Nellie was taken to the asylum to be assessed. The doctors there examined her, treating her like she was a specimen, not letting her try and convince them that she wasn't insane. The doctors declared her mentally ill, and she was admitted into the asylum. By admitting herself to the asylum for 10 days, Nellie Bly changed the way society saw and treated the mentally ill. In her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, Nellie described the events that took place while she was there. This examination over, we heard someone yell, "Go out into the hall." One of the patients kindly explained that this was an invitation to supper. We latecomers tried to keep it together, so we entered the hall and stood at the door where all the women had crowded. How we shivered as we stood there. The windows were open and the draught went whizzing through the hall. The patients looked blue with cold, and the minutes stretched into a quarter of an hour. At last, one of the nurses went forward and unlocked the door, through which we all crowded to the landing of the stairway. The table reached the length of the room and was uncovered and uninviting. Long benches without backs were put out for the patients to sit on, and over these they had to crawl in order to face the table. Placed close together all along the table were large dressing bowls fixed with pinkish-looking stuff, which the patients called tea. By each bowl was laid a piece of bread, cut thick and buttered. A small saucer containing 5 prunes accompanied the bread. Oh, that comb-in! I never realized before what the expression, "I'll give you a comb-in" meant, but I knew then my hair, all matted and wet from the night previous, was pulled and jerked, and after expostulating to no avail, I set my teeth and endured the pain. They refused to give me my hairpins, and my hair was arranged in one plait and tied with a red cotton rag. My curly bangs refused to stay back. I have described my first day in the asylum, and as my other 9 were exactly the same. In the general run of things, it would be tiresome to tell about each. In giving this story, I expect to be contradicted by many who are exposed. I merely tell in common words, without exaggeration, of my life in a madhouse for 10 days. After Nellie Bly's 10 days were up, lawyers rescued her from the asylum, claiming she was a journalist not mentally ill. She returned back to reality and wrote the expose that was published in the World. This expose would reveal the harsh conditions of the asylum that was unknown by the residents of New York. The expose uncovered and told the truth of the neglect and physical abuse, disturbing conditions of the asylum, and influenced a large-scale investigation of the institution. Nellie Bly assisted this investigation of the asylum that helped transform the city's hospitals of the time. The expose brought forth changes to be made that included a greater provision of funds for the mentally ill patients. It also led to additional physicians hired for stricter supervisions of the nurses and other healthcare workers, and finally put in place regulations and guidelines to prevent overpopulation and fire hazards at the city's medical facilities. Without the leadership of Nellie Bly, the investigation would have never taken place, and the asylums today may still have been as they were in years past, with harsh conditions and inhumane actions.
Nellie Bly's story on the Blackwell's Island Asylum shows that mental illness is something that's difficult to diagnose, and that the treatment of patients needs to be patient and kind. We shouldn't just warehouse the mentally ill as they were in Nellie Bly's day. Caretakers now, of course, have to be much more professional than they were back then.
Nellie Bly led the way for undercover reporting and helped expose wrongdoings that helped change the world.
Nellie Bly's work shows us that people in authority don't always have the well-being of others in mind, and that powerful people can be deceived, just like anyone else. The readers of her newspaper, Pulitzer's World, were learning about the dangers they faced in New York City. Many of them were common folks, immigrants who were mistreated as workers and consumers. And within a few decades, they had enough political power to get progressive legislation passed to protect them in the workplace and in the marketplace.
Nellie Bly will always be remembered for her adventurous spirit and unwillingness to give up during times of struggle and hardships.